If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. No one was like him. Terrible were his crimes. But if you wish to blackguard the great king, think how mean, obscure, and dull you are. Your labours lowly, and your merits less. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Robert Lowell's poem on Alexander. No one was like him. I'm Keith Hockton, and welcome to the second episode on Alexander the Great. I think what Lowell's actually trying to say is that Alexander is the absolute apex predator. You know, people keep saying, oh, you know, he did terrible things. He's a kind of an evil man for conquering the world, but he's a warrior king in a warrior age. And, you know, obviously there were people who blamed him for the woes of the world. So Demosthenes, you know, the news came to him that Alexander had died, and he says, surely the stench of his corpse would fill the world. But Demosthenes is a terrible man himself. And of course, Alexander was no angel. In the previous episode, Alexander has conquered Egypt. He's also founded the great city of Alexandria and the great library of Alexandria. And he's had an audience with Amun in the oasis of Siwa. And he's now preparing to strike east and attack Darius, the Achaemenid king of Persia. So I think I said in the last episode that there was a point here at which Alexander could have stopped conquering. In many ways, it would have been a very sensible thing to do. And in fact, his general and great friend, Parmenion, has actually said to him, basically, you know, when you take that deal that Darius is offering you, which is, you know, you take the western bits of the kingdom, the western fringe of the Persian Empire, you will be the richest man who ever walked the earth. Why don't you take that deal? And look, maybe if you are a mean, obscure, and dull man, maybe that's what you do. But this is Alexander the Great. And if truth be told, he already held those territories anyway. He didn't need to be given them or granted them by Darius. He had them. So he and his school friends and their 60,000 hardened warriors set off from Memphis. And they go back up the coast of Phoenicia, and then they turn right. So effectively, they turn east. Now, Darius, all this time, has been amassing a new army in Babylon. And Babylon is the largest city in Persia. He's got loads of elephants. He's got more of his own family there to support him. You know, remember, in the last episode, he actually left his mum and his wife to the mercy of Alexander. He's also got loads of chariots, and, you know, he's got distant men. He's got a cousin who joins him called Bessus. And Bessus is a kind of Hollywood nasty. He's a nasty Persian. If you're going to stereotype a Persian in a Hollywood movie, this would be the guy that you took. He's black-bearded. He's got dark eyes. He's a kind of a pantomime villain, if you like. But he's come from Bactria with a lot of cavalry. Bactria is in the backwoods of Afghanistan and beyond. You know, it's kind of even on the fringes of Iran, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan. So he's come a long way. And he's a mean man. And he's pitched up with all these wild warriors from the mountains. And Darius has what seems to be, for all intents and purposes, a very good plan. He's going to tempt Alexander. He's going to burn all the fields before him, you know, kind of a scorched earth policy. And he's decided where he wants to face him to give him the best advantage. And he wants to face him in a place called Gaglamela. It's in Iraq, and I think it's actually now called Arbela. It's in Kurdistan. It's unbearably hot. There's dust everywhere, and there's nothing there to see. Even now, there's nothing there to see. But the dust will actually end up being really quite important in this battle. So, as I said, even if you turn up there now, there's not much to see. Actually, there's nothing to see, just dust and the odd camel, you know, asleep under a dead palm tree. And if there is anyone listening from there, my apologies, my sincere apologies. But you know I'm telling you the truth. So the Macedonian army, the Greeks, if you like, have just turned up and they just keep coming and coming and coming. And Alexander maybe now has 100,000 men under his control. And of course, the sources actually say that they arrive in October 331 BC. And what Alexander does is he goes to the top of the hill and he looks out at the Persian masses. And he must be thinking, holy cow. That's a huge Persian army, because the sources also say, the Greek sources say, that Darius has 1 million men. I actually think that's very unrealistic, but some also think that he may have had a few 100,000, and he probably did. So Alexander has about half that number of men. And of course, Darius has got these chariots that I talked about. He's got masses of elephants. He's got both of those. And you can tell that Alexander is probably a wee bit concerned, because what he doesn't do is attack straight away. He watches what the Persians are up to. He then walks the camp, chatting to his men, which is one of the things that they absolutely love about him. And he takes a few days to kind of think about it. And then he decides, okay, we're going to attack. And then there is this extraordinary story, which I'm sure you will say is made up, but the sources say it's true. He goes to sleep early in the evening, and the next day, all his captains are up early and they're ready. And, they've all kind of got oiled up or whatever it is they do before a battle. I mean, I'd get oiled up. Wouldn't you? I wouldn't want anyone grabbing me in the hand-to-hand fighting. So if there's a swimming pool of oil, I'm in the pool. But Alexander is still in bed, and the captains can't have their breakfast until he wakes up. It's an unwritten rule. And of course, he doesn't wake up. He actually sleeps in. And eventually Parmenion goes to him. He goes into the tent and he wakes him and he says, "What's wrong with you? How can you oversleep today of all days?" And Alexander looks at him lovingly and says, "Because it's the one day when I'm not worried. I know we're going to fight, and I know that we are going to win." Something else very plausible happens immediately afterwards too. He gets on his horse, Bucephalus, the horse who's descended from a unicorn, and strangely, the horse that's also afraid of its own shadow. And he says to his men, "Men, we're about to win. Zeus is with us." And then, you know what they see overhead in the sky? They see an eagle. And an eagle is the messenger of the gods, a sign that they're truly going to win. And look, I'm sure that does happen because it's in the sources. And of course they do. They win. It's very dusty and the battle is very confusing. You've effectively got 300,000 men hand-to-hand fighting on the battlefield. You've got elephants charging in. You've got cavalry. You've got chariots. It must have been absolutely mayhem. And eventually, the Persians effectively run from the battlefield. And of course, that opens up the Persian line for Alexander's cavalry, and they shoot straight in. And this is what they do best. So this time, Darius is unlucky. His men run away, but he doesn't run away at first. He tries to encourage them to fight, but it doesn't work. And then, of course, he has to leave the battlefield himself. And of course, there's a massive confusion because no one can see him. So it's not actually clear whether he leaves the battlefield by himself or whether he leads with Bessus or whether Bessus actually takes him prisoner, because maybe he can actually use him to barter with the Greeks, not to slaughter everyone in their sight. It's unclear. But he and Bessus basically vanish. So now Alexander occupies Babylon. He then takes the city of Susa. He fights another battle with another Persian army, and he smashes them. And then he gets to Persepolis. And Persepolis is the heartland of Persia. By all accounts, it's an absolutely beautiful city. At this point, the Greeks, they must be thinking, wow, this is on a scale that we've never seen before. And of course, they behave very badly by raping and killing indiscriminately. So the question that comes to mind to me is, to what extent was Alexander's, conquest of Persia actually intended as revenge for the campaigns against Darius and Darius's ancestors? So keep in mind, we're talking about Darius III. Darius I actually invaded Greece in 492 BC. That actually resulted in the Battle of Marathon. Then you've got, Xerxes, Darius I's son. He invades in 479 BC, and that results in the Battle of Thermopylae, where effectively, King Leonidas, of the 300 Spartan fame, he's involved in that. And of course, then there was the Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Plataea. So it's a reasonable question, I think, that pertains to, does Alexander do it because of those previous conquests? And of course, the other thing is, if he backs down now, will the Persians come right back at him? So Alexander turns up in Persepolis, and Persepolis, of all the great Persian capitals, is the one that means the most to the Persians. And it's the one that's actually associated with the Achaemenid dynasty, the dynasty of the Persian kings to which Darius III belongs. In Babylon and in Susa, I think Alexander has actually behaved with exemplary forbearance. In fact, in Susa, he actually allows the Persian commander of the citadel there to stay in office. So what you see here is that he's already accommodating himself to the local elites. And of course, in due course, he is going to appoint a Persian as a satrap of Babylon. He's a great general. He's also a top politician. He understands how politics are played. He's a political strategist. And I have to say that out of all the people that I've talked about over my podcast, he's probably one of the best of them. And he's still in his mid-20s. He clearly has this astonishing ability to read a situation, politically as well as militarily. And he understands in a way that many, many of the Greeks don't, that the only way that he can possibly hope to establish, Greek rule over this vast empire that he has conquered is, in a sense, is to get the Persians on board, step into the platform heels of the Persians, I say. And I think he's more imaginative than most of his comrades. In fact, I think he's one of the most imaginative rulers that ever lived. And think about the time that he was around. So he sees straight away, I think when he gets there, this isn't just now a matter of making themselves very rich and going back and, buying a big farm or buying a villa, overlooking the Aegean. He suddenly thinks that the Persian machine is ripe for the taking, that he doesn't need to smash the machine. He thinks he can take it over, and he thinks that he can get it to work for himself. He can be the next great Persian king. And I think that's basically what he thinks. And in reality, why wouldn't you? He can be ruler of absolutely everything. He's already Pharaoh of Egypt. He can rule everything. And eventually he does. But interestingly, and I mentioned this in the first episode, he never takes the title of King of Kings. He never does that. And I think that says something about Alexander. But he does take over the regional ones. So he treats Babylon and Susa as a Persian king would treat them. But Persepolis is very different. It's the dynastic capital of the Achaemenid Empire. So what's he going to do with it? And what he ends up deciding is that he's going to obliterate it. He's going to burn it to the ground. So again, it comes back to, is this revenge for the centuries of invasion that they've suffered, that the Greeks and the Macedonians have actually suffered by the Persian hand? So what he does is he has this massive party to celebrate his victory. And there's lots of drinking, as you can imagine. And of course, historians argue, and they say that he destroys Persepolis as part of his policy, that he's always meant to do it, that it's deliberate revenge for the destruction of the Greek temples. But of course, there are other sources that argue this and say no. And what actually happens is they're having this great party one night, and this is the first point at which historians have actually realized that his 60,000 plus men have actually been traveling with lots of women. And of course, you would ascertain by that effectively they're Athenian prostitutes, and there are thousands of them traveling with this horde. Ptolemy, who's one of Alexander's great captains, who then goes on to lead the Ptolemaic dynasty, he has his favorite, a woman called Tassos. And she says, when they're all absolutely hammered one night, the partying has been going on for days, she says that she goes to Alexander and actually says, look, you've done an amazing job. We all love you. Why don't you let me lead us in burning down Persepolis? And apparently he then says, great idea. And so they all get torches and they burn it to the ground. And look, historians have actually argued about this ever since. Did she really do this? Was she the one who instigated the burning? I don't think that she did. And I think that's also the great thing about Alexander, that he attracts these outwardly ridiculous stories. He's literally, through history, he's like a blotting paper soaking up the ink of historians. Anyway, he ends up burning down Persepolis. But the question is, why does he do it? And the interesting thing, though, is that when you read the academic historians, they're all divided pretty much 50-50 on why he did that. And it's clearly because some of them can't get themselves to let go of the story that they read, when they were about 9 years old. So what we don't know is why he did it, and we never will. Obviously burning down Persepolis is going to play well with the Greeks back home. It's a good political move. And Alexander is always looking back to Greece because there's always stirrings in Greece. The Spartans are still playing their games. The Athenians are restive. And at some point, Alexander is going to send his Greeks back home. So he needs to keep the Greeks on board. So burning Persepolis, he can actually pitch that as being revenge for Athens and being attacked by Xerxes. I mean, effectively, he can make 1,000 excuses as to why he did it. And keep in mind, Persepolis is not the biggest city in Persia. The biggest city is actually Babylon, and he doesn't burn Babylon to the ground. Persepolis, on the other hand, is expendable. You can burn that down. You can get away with that because it sends a great political message, and you're not actually losing that much by doing so. And more importantly, for Alexander, I think you can actually frame it to the Persians themselves that he is attacking the dynasty and he's not attacking Persia. Because what he already has done is shown respect to the city of Susa. And from this point on, having burnt down Persepolis, Alexander is going to great pains to show his respect for Persian customs. But what he does next is really interesting because he doesn't say, I'm now going to stay and rule. What he says is, Darius, although he's beaten, is out there somewhere. And he's fled with Bessus, and we don't know where that guy is, and we're going to hunt him down. So what they do is they leave and they search for him. At this point, Bessus has actually decided that he wants to be the next Persian king, and he calls himself Artaxerxes IV, and he flees to Afghanistan, which is also under Persian rule. Alexander eventually finds Darius bleeding to death. He's been abandoned by his men. Alexander is kind of charging along the road with his hordes, and they come across a litter, and they're on their way to Khorasan in the east, and they know that Darius is ahead of them somewhere. And they stop one day, and they actually see this sort of battered kind of old chariot, lying by the side of the road. And they go and look inside, and there is Darius bleeding to death. And he says to one of Alexander's captains, the guy who finds him, Polystratus, he says, tell Alexander, thank you for looking after my mum and my wife. Tell him I give him my right hand. And then he dies. Of course, the genius of this is that Alexander can now cast himself as the avenger of Darius and the rightful heir of the king of Persia. And of course, that story is actually told by Alexander himself. Well, so the sources tell us. But then the question is, do they capture Bessus? And they now know that Bessus has actually fled to Afghanistan. So if they're going to do that, there's a long way to go. And it's at this point that you kind of say, okay, something very weird is going on, because anybody else in Alexander's position, I think, would say, you know what, we've been on the road for 8 years. I'm now the new king of Persia. We're kind of done. Or would you? I mean, Alexander surely wouldn't chase him into Afghanistan. I mean, when you think about it, that's absolutely demented. And of course, we know in modern times, Afghanistan can be a womb of warriors. But of course, if you're now claiming to be the king of Persia, which Bessa now is, and you've retreated to the mountains of Afghanistan, you'd feel pretty safe because you're in your own stronghold. But of course, what he's never faced is someone like Alexander, a young warrior king who has just conquered the entirety of Persia, who's now claiming also to be the Persian king. And I think from Alexander's perspective, he actually can't afford to leave Bessa up there. because at some stage, Besser will attack. But in many ways, I also think it's a bridge slightly too far. And the reason, for Alexander going, you could say it's a little bit odd. But I think this is also where the contentious issues start. This is when you get the first reports of discontent among the Greeks and the Macedonians, the high command. And I think that's really reasonable because nobody wants to go into Afghanistan. And it's only after that they first go to Afghanistan that Alexander actually discovers that there's a plot to kill him. And Plotus, who is the son of Parmenion, his chief general and very good friend, is actually in on it. And Alexander basically says, right, well, if Plotus is in on it, then Parmenion also has to be in on it, and I have to kill both of you. And he does. And I think it's at that point where some of his high command think, hang on, I didn't sign up for this adventure to, eventually invade Afghanistan, India. I actually signed up just to make some money. And, you said it was only going to be 2 years. And I didn't think we would be thousands of miles from home and 8 years into this adventure. So maybe it's time that we turned back. But I think if you think that, then it also contradicts the fact that Alexander also has good strategic reasons for what he's doing up there, because Alexander basically is starting to think no longer like a Greek or a Macedonian. I think he's thinking, I've just conquered Persia and I need to get the Persians on board, which is a completely different thing. And the rank and file don't have to bother with that. They can leave me to that. But I also think on the other side of that, you've got an entire army that's sitting there. We've been following you for years. We're soldiers from Europe. We don't want to go heading up into Afghanistan. It's this mad, completely terrifying place full of people who want to kill you and an impossible place to capture. But you can equally see that Alexander's claim to rule Persia actually depends on him eliminating a rival to that title. It also requires him, if he's going to be a king of the Persian Empire, he needs to lay claim to all the lands that were ruled by the Persians. And this is the point at which, kind of where we get the first reports of him actually wearing Persian clothes. So he wears a Persian purple cloak. He wears a Persian diadem, which is tied to your forehead by a white ribbon. And he starts to ask his men to greet him in the Persian way. Kind of prokinesis. It's often described as a sort of groveling on the ground and the kissing of the floor, but it's actually not that at all. It's been mistaken for that. It's really about, I don't know how to describe this without it sounding comical, but it's not, because we're talking about a warrior king. It's really kind of about blowing them a kiss, but it's a more formal kiss. It's kind of exchanging kisses. I don't know how else to describe this to you. So Alexander's actually traveled with a historian, a guy by the name of Callisthenes, who's actually Aristotle's nephew. He's Aristotle's protege, and he's come as the expedition historian, which is yet more testimony to, I think, Alexander's educatedness. But it ends in a kind of a twisted plot. This historian actually refuses to do the Persian kiss. And Alexander says to him, well, if you won't do it, I won't give you a kiss. And he kind of says, oh, well, I can actually live with that. And of course, Alexander is absolutely outraged by this and has him killed. They rack him and then they hang him, I think. And he's then, kind of carried around the battlefield in a cage, which is a bit harsh, for refusing to blow a kiss. But Alexander is sending a very clear message. And what he says to his men is, you have no choice. We're going into Afghanistan. And of course, they follow him because he's Alexander. He has this dark shadow that just entices men to him. So of course they follow him. And of course, the end result is they capture Bessus. Bessus is also tortured. Actually, he's tortured to death. And of course, you have to keep in mind with this story, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm actually compressing it a lot for you because this doesn't happen in an instance. From Persia to conquering Afghanistan, it takes years. And of course, what I don't want to do is go through this blow by blow. But what I'm trying to tell you is how amazing Alexander is at persuading his men to follow him. And of course, the story that I'm actually telling you actually took 3 years. And they're on the road for that entire time. And of course, it's awful. It's awful travel. You know, these guys are always scaling mountains that have never been scaled by Europeans before. They're always scaling these massive rocks in the cold and in the heat. So there are certain things happening too, which is that Alexander starts killing his nearest and dearest. So in the first episode, you remember that I said he was actually saved by a guy with the name of Black Celtus, you know, at the Battle of Granicus. Alexander kills him in a murderous brawl in a drunken rage. And of course, Alexander is also busy founding cities, you know, called Alexandria, left, right, and center, all over Afghanistan. And during one of these stages, he actually marries the daughter of one of the Persian satraps. And he's called Oxyates, and his daughter is called Roxana. She isn't actually the obvious person to marry. No, there are actually better connected Persian noblemen in the heartland. So the question is, why marry her? I mean, she lives in the absolute wilds of Afghanistan. And I would suggest he's doing it because he needs to pacify the Afghanis. And what that tells you is that he's also in deep trouble at that time because he needs allies. And I think the interesting thing is that those foundations, you know, those Greek foundations, they actually endure. And those Greek traditions in Afghanistan actually last much longer than Greek rule in Persia itself. I mean, Alexander actually goes beyond Afghanistan. He conquers Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Pakistan. And at that point, again, you have to ask yourself, what is he doing there? Why are they so far from home? And I suppose, really, you know, that's the absolute fascination of Alexander. You know, you can cast it as either absolutely lunatic or absolutely solid, strategic, firm sense. And you know what? Perhaps it's both. I think personally there's a point here where he's actually addicted to the routine of the conquest. And he just doesn't want to go back to Greece and just be that Greek ruler that sits in temple. I also think it's about having to make Persia secure. And to secure it fully, to do that, he then must invade India, because India is also part of the Persian Empire. But keep in mind that these guys have now been on the road for over 8 years. And I can only imagine how exhausted his men are. You know, they've been through some of the most hideous conditions of all kinds, and lots of them have been lost along the way. They've now got different weapons that they started out with. They've got different armor. You know, they're not wearing the same clothes, and they've accumulated this massive baggage train of kind of hangers-on. And it's at this point at which somebody actually says to Alexander, do you have to go into India? And what happens is he actually gets approached by an Indian from Taxala who comes to Alexander's court and says, look, if you're going to finish what you started, you have to come and give us a hand. You have to come to the Indus River. It's the line that marks the limits of Persian rule. So at the beginning of the first podcast, I said to you, you know, as Alexander steps into Persia, he throws a spear. And the spear basically is the symbol of, at the Persians, and he throws this spear, which basically tells them he's about to conquer their empire. So if Alexander is laying claim to the spear, you know, of one Persian empire, to legitimately be able to conquer it, he has to go into India. He has to keep going. So he does exactly that. He goes down to Taxila, which is roughly in today's Islamabad, and there he meets the naked philosophers that I talked about in the first episode. And he then goes to the river Jhelum, where he meets King Porus, who's actually king of the Punjab. And he actually sends Porus a message saying, I'd like to meet with you. Porus sends a message back saying, great, I'd like to meet with you too. And I'll meet you on the banks of the Jhelum. And by the way, I'll be bringing elephants and a massive army, more elephants than you've ever seen before, and I'll see you there. And Alexander sends a message back saying, great, you know, I'm up for it too. Wear your big pants or go home. And of course, the long and the short of that is that Alexander pitches up, he crosses the river, he defeats the elephants in a raging monsoon, I have to say. And this is where the big spears come into play because they're obviously quite handy. And, I talked about the big spears being developed by his father, Philip II, in the first episode, and this is where he uses them. And I knew when I was talking about the big spears in that episode that there was a reason for their development. So Porus actually has, massive elephant battalions, but it doesn't even faze Alexander. Porus isn't killed, and Alexander actually says to him, you know what, you actually fought tremendously well. I think you're a fine fellow. Why don't we become allies, and you can basically become a glorified satrap. And Porus, of course, says, great, that's exactly what I had in mind, and they become great pals. So he basically incorporates Porus's kingdom into his orbit, as it were, but he keeps going. And his men are now at the point where they're begging him to go home. But no, he invades India because he thinks he's going to get to the end of the world. And this is the main reason for him doing it. And I think a lot of Alexander's story is very much mythologized because it's the nature of the sources. But anyway, he and his army cross more rivers and they get to the river Hydaspes. And, there's a dreadful scene because, his men are in terrible shape. They've walked through a monsoon. They've been hit by malaria. They've been attacked by lots of snakes they weren't expecting, and they're very miserable. And they meet with Indians and they say, is this the end of the world? Is this where the world ends? Because what they then think is they're going to build ships and they're going to sail around and back to Greece. But the Indians say, no, actually, it's not the end of the world. There is actually more India if you continue that way, if you keep going. There's actually more civilizations and there's some very fierce empires there. And, at this stage, the senior advisors say, are you kidding? This is definitely time to go home. And of course, all of these accounts of Alexander actually come from Rome. But are they about Rome? Because historians of Alexander don't think that they're actually about Alexander. And I would actually go a little bit further and say that it's also about constructing the myth of Alexander as a kind of Achilles figure, one that never knows when to stop. What I think is that Alexander reaches the Indus. He reaches the limits of what had been Persian rule, and that's when he decides to turn back, because there's now no reason for him to go any further. And it seems to me a striking coincidence that he actually decides to turn back exactly at the point where Persian rule ends. And I think that significance is actually quite striking. I also think that by the time these stories actually come to be written, there's a lot of interest in the idea of kind of limitless empire, where the idea of Alexander as someone who is pushing to the absolute ends of the earth is becoming, he's starting to be transmuted into myth. And I think what the mutiny myth does is actually give Alexandrian historians a reason for him to turn around and go back, because it actually doesn't make him look too bad. But I don't think it's the case. And of course, the Alexandrians actually say, there are stories that he cried, that he was sulking, and that he is suicidal and self-destructive, afterwards. I don't think they're true either, because that doesn't marry to the persona that we have come to know as Alexander. That's not the person who conquers the entire Persian Empire. Anyway, food for thought. Let's take a break and a message from our sponsor, and then come back and finish this epic story. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So Alexander, for whatever reason you care to think, has turned around in India. He's finally going home. That being said, he never takes the easy road, and the journey home is way more complicated than you might think, because he doesn't go back the way he came. Oh no. That would be far too easy for Alexander. He decides he's going to go back through an impenetrable desert, one that actually wiped out Cyrus the Great's army. And this is the desert that Cyrus the Great failed to cross. And the reason that Alexander decides to do that? Because Cyrus the Great is actually the founder of the empire that Alexander now rules, and Cyrus failed at it. And if Alexander hasn't already made his mark, this will mark him as one of the greatest rulers that ever walked the earth. So he and his men are going to march through the desert. And of course, predictably, it goes horribly wrong, doesn't it? I mean, it can't but not. But he actually does better than Cyrus. And what he does do, though, is he loses colossal numbers of men. And don't forget that they've had this huge baggage train of women and children with them as well. And of course, they also all die. He also eventually loses touch with his fleet. And finally, after this dreadful march, which does seem a bit of a deluded thing to do. I mean, we talk about him being a strategic genius, but there's absolutely no strategic sense for this march at all, except that he's marching along parallel to his fleet. And I think that's the point, isn't it? And I think that's why he does it. He doesn't do it because he wants to outbest, Cyrus the Great. I think he does it because he's interested in his fleet. And what the fleet are doing is actually checking out ports and trade routes. And the idea is that they will actually keep the fleet supplied from the land. And of course, that goes horribly wrong. But the fleet will actually map that coastline. Alexander has already established himself as a Persian monarch. He's married Roxana, and what he now does, just after he makes it through the desert, he now marries Darius's daughter, Sutira, and I think also one of Sutira's lesser sisters. And he holds this amazing wedding, this great wedding as they've come out of the desert, and then he also makes lots of his Greek pals marry lots of Persian women. And the other mistake that he makes at this particular time is he tries to reform the army. He's sending some of them back to Persia, and he's bringing in Persians and Afghanis. And so this is actually what inspires, I was just thinking about this then, but this actually inspires Sir William Woodthorpe Tarp, the great Alexandrian enthusiast, for the idea that Alexander is actually a prince of peace, which generally I think people now know is not the case. But he's actually the godfather of all Alexandrian studies. But I think the key thing here is that it's only the Persians. Alexander isn't actually really interested in any of his other peoples. It's only the Persians. And that's what Alexander is suddenly all about. That's why he's marrying Persians. And that's why he's doing what he's doing. And that's why he's wearing what he's wearing. He's becoming a Persian king. When he gets back, he promotes one of his followers to be the ruler of Persia. And I think that's really telling. And that's what this is all about. And then there is a mutiny at Opus, and this is where he gathers his men together, the ringleaders at the front. And he says, I'm going to send a lot of you home now. Well done. You've done an amazing job for me, but you're now finished. The quest is over. You're heading home. And the legions, if you call them that, really kind of cut up rough about this because they know that they're being cut out of his new empire and that they'll eventually be supplanted by Persian replacements. In his court, he's got Persian secretaries. And this is where the eunuch Bagoas comes in, who's clearly at Alexander's side day and night. And they become great friends, and it's then rumored that he becomes his companion. He's also now dressing in Persian outfits. And of course, the troops don't like it because they're basic men. These were Greek stroke, Macedonian farmers. They're men from the land. And they feel that he's betraying them to this sort of, I guess, foppish, kind of luxurious kind of ruler. The very people, actually, that they had always been brought up to despise, I suppose. The last year of his life is quite miserable because his great mate, Hephaestion, he dies of fever, and Alexander actually builds a monument to him, which still stands today, amazingly, in the city of Hamadan. And if you ever decide to go there, it's there. It's actually worthwhile going just to see that statue, over 2,300 years old. And of course, what we now know is that Alexander, in the last year of his life, is actually planning new expeditions. Arion has this brilliant line, which is actually too good to be true. But I think it is. I'm going to go with that. He says, even if Alexander had added the island of the Britons to Europe, he would still have gone on looking for unknown lands. So he's in Babylon planning a new invasion of Arabia. He's drinking a great deal at this stage, and then suddenly he just dies. But of course, the question has always been, is he murdered or does he just die? If truth be told, we actually have no way of ever knowing. But look, I'm going to take a poke at it. He falls ill on the 28th of May, 323, at a party that's being held by his men, and he doesn't actually die until the 11th of June. So that's 10 to 14 days, and most historians don't think there's poisons in the ancient world that take that long to take effect. And of course, if you were going to assassinate him, you would do it very quickly, and you would have a succession plan in mind. None of those things happened. Babylon at this stage is well known for malaria, and of course, a host of other diseases. And it just makes sense that he catches something and eventually dies from it. Remember, there is no cure for absolutely anything in those days, not even the common cold. So I would guess that he's physically exhausted. We know he's drinking far too much, and his system is completely run down with no defense. And it's hot. It's really hot. And of course, there's no sanitation. So, malaria makes sense to me because it fits all the symptoms. But look, we'll never know. And sometimes ancient history just isn't that easy. And of course, it's exactly the same when you think about this with the Muslim conquests, the Arab conquests, and the difficulty in accepting, these as historical fact, because there are no real detailed accounts from that time. It's all 200 to 300 years after the event happened. And I think the same is true for Alexander. I think Alexander promotes brilliant stories, and I think this is an amazing story. It also makes for wonderful children's books. It makes for wonderful novels and so forth. But I think that it's very difficult to know if you're actually writing it as history. And what's also really interesting is that Alexander actually appears in the Quran. He's the two-horned one. And of course, the two-horned one can only be the horns of Amun. The details of this trip to Siwa, the oasis of Siwa, where he goes to see the oracle of Amun, has this kind of distorted echo in the Quran, which is interesting because it's so opposed to idolatry and to paganism and all that kind of stuff. And yet, there he is. Alexander is in the Quran. And you know what? So after researching this, I had so many questions that I subsequently answered through more research, but I thought I'd raise them with you here just in case you have the same questions. I had questions about legacy and empire and so on. And the first one was his empire too big to sustain, too big to last? Because on his deathbed, according to the sources, his captains ask him, "To whom will you leave your kingdom?" And he says, "Toi crassus toi," to the strongest. And of course, what we then subsequently know is that all falls apart. The lads who have actually been with him the entire time, they all turn on each other and they fight each other and they kill each other. And it kind of ends up with Seleucus. He basically takes over Persia and much of Asia. Ptolemy, as we know, gets Egypt and starts that whole Ptolemaic dynastic line. Antipater and his son Cassander take Macedonia, and Antigonus takes Persia. So it's very much a Game of Thrones, type scenario. But I guess the question is could Alexander's dynasty have lasted? I think had Alexander lived, I think if he had established a secure succession, I actually think it's perfectly possible. I think he would also have had to make Persia its center. And the thing is, none of his successors, none of his captains, the lads who were with him from the start, actually want that. The lads don't want to be out east. Alexander did, and this is the big difference. And I think had Alexander ruled either from Susa or from Babylon, with his prestige, with his political nous, I think he could have carried it. Would he have faced revolts in Greece? Yeah, for sure. But, he also might have said, you know what, I'll cut Greece free. And keep in mind, he still had a massive army in Macedonia waiting for him to return. But I think that the infrastructure of the Achaemenid rule is there. And Alexander is the only one in his group that actually understands its value. Like the Ptolemies in Egypt, I think Alexander's dynasty could have prospered and lasted. But the problem you have with that is that, Alexander never really shows any interest in doing any of that. I mean, he's shown great strategic and political nous in dealing, and conquering and so forth. But he really hasn't actually shown any interest in just governing and forming that dynasty. What he's really interested in is fighting and conquering. He loves that shit. But some would argue that that's not quite true. I know there's historians out there that are going to be saying, well, that's absolutely not true. And, his appointment, his satraps, his concern with military organization, with administrative organization, putting all of that in place is a good argument for that. But I think the telling tale is that in the last year of his life, he's already thinking about a new expedition. Another question that I had was, where is his body? And for absolutely sure, it ended up in Alexandria. Ptolemy actually takes it there. And it also gets visited there by the future Roman Emperor Augustus. But it's not there now. It's not in Alexandria now. But you know where I think it is? I think it's in Venice. Yes, Venice. Because the Venetians actually arrive in Alexandria looking for the body of St. Mark. And they go in. And Alexandria at this stage is in a time of chaos, and they look around, and I think what they do is they find a body that they're looking for in this amazing shrine. There's nothing that marks it as St. Mark's body, but you would assume it's Alexander's because it is this fantastic shrine. They assume it's St. Mark's, and they remove it, and they take it to Venice. And so my money says that Alexander's body now actually lays in San Marco. I'm convinced of it. Now, there are some people that might be listening to this podcast who say, look, what you've described over these past two podcasts is somebody who fought a lot of battles and, they climb a lot of mountains and conquer rocks that have never been seen or heard of before, and they behave in outlandish ways. But so what? Is it anything more than basically just a very early version of The Lord of the Rings without the rings, for adults? And does Alexander actually matter, do you think? He inaugurates what we call the Hellenistic Age, the idea of synthesis of East and West. But the question is, do you think that would have happened anyway, or do you think it took Alexander and his conquests to do that? I did a podcast on counterfactuals, on what ifs. And this is a big what if. But like Churchill, I think Alexander is one of those individuals that stands out, and I think it does matter. And keep in mind also, there was that famous German historian in the 1920s, Karl Becker, who said, without Alexander the Great, there would be no Islamic civilization. And I would argue no Christianity either. Alexander actually creates the common Greek language. But you could say that the culture becomes a kind of koine. It's a bit of a melting pot in which Greek, Persian, Mesopotamian, and Jewish influences all kind of mix and mingle. And that is the petri dish from which Christianity, I would also say rabbinical Judaism and Islam will emerge. Those are absolutely seismic developments. So I think Alexander matters a great deal. I think he also matters because of the model that he presents to later Roman emperors as well. Pompey and Augustus, for example. And of course, their question and my question is, was Alexander actually great? And if so, for what? And in comparison to whom? So it seems to be the Romans who call him great, and the earliest reference to him as great is in a play by a Roman playwright called Plautus in the early 2nd century BC. And it seems to kind of derive, I guess, from a desire. There are lots of Alexanders who were Macedonian kings. There were heaps of them. So they have to define him, and they call him the Great. And the Romans also had this amazing kind of cognomen, which is, it's kind of like a descriptive word. The cognomen served as a marker of identity, of legacy. So Alexander is kind of a Roman cognomen, and Pompey the Great goes to the east and he conquers vast swathes of what had been Alexander's empire. And he reportedly brings back Alexander's cloak. I'm sure it was Alexander's cloak. I mean, come on, 300 years after he wore it. You can just imagine there's a guy there with a stall in Alexandria going, Alexander's cloak, come and get Alexander's cloak. I mean, honestly. Anyway, he brings it back. He says it's Alexander's cloak. He adopts Alexander's hairstyle, with this kind of Elvis quiff. And I think what that does is it embeds the idea of greatness. And of course, the Romans have a very ambivalent kind of relationship to that because of their complete distrust of kings. And actually, the question, Rome is meant to be an empire without limits, according to Virgil. That's why I think there's this great fascination with Alexander, with a king, a conqueror who dreams of an empire without limits. And they can't let that go. And I think that's a huge part of what's going on with these stories about Alexander. None of Rome's emperors can actually do what Alexander has done. They try and they fail. He is their yardstick. And that again, burnishes the legend that is Alexander, of someone who could actually do it. But of course, Alexander's empire doesn't last, and Augustus's does. And Augustus is Octavian at the point when he's actually in Alexandria looking at the body of Alexander. He's standing outside Alexander's tomb. I mean, this is an extraordinary moment in history. Augustus standing in front of Alexander. Cleopatra has just died. She's just killed herself. And Octavian actually goes down to see the tomb of Alexander, and he stands there staring at it in silence for hours. And he eventually leaves flowers on the tomb. And as he leaves, the attendants of the tomb come to him and they say, "Would you also like to see the tombs of the Ptolemies now?" And Octavian says, "No. I didn't come to see dead men's corpses. I came to see a god." Guys, thank you for listening in to these two podcasts, but it's been an absolute blast, presenting them to you. He's someone that I wanted to cover for a very, very long time, and I hope I've done him justice. Thanks again, folks, and I will talk to you next week. Bye for now.